Will just dropped the rage bait comment and left. That's all. They don't care. I just want people to rage bait. Interact to their comments. See, they're just doing rage bait. Yeah. You didn't need to block them, honestly. All right, let's get started. All right. Part 2, dialectical paths of consciousness to truth. A, an opinions of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin about dialectical paths of consciousness to truth. The section below outlines and explains the universal laws of consciousness, which holds that consciousness is a process of dialectical development in which practical activity leads to conscious activity, which then leads back to practical activity in a conscious and never-ending cycle, with the tendency of develop both practical and conscious activity to increasingly higher levels. In his philosophical notebook, Lenin generalized the dialectical path towards the realization of truth as development from vivid visualizations to abstract thinking, and then from extraction back to practice. This process, according to Lenin, is a dialectical path towards the realization of truth and the realization of objective reality. According to this generalization, the dialectical path towards the realization of truth here refers to a correct and accurate reflection of objective reality in a process. It is a process that starts from vivid visualization, emotional consciousness, to abstract thinking, rational consciousness. Given that consciousness has a material basis and that practical activities are the driving force of consciousness, it follows that we must strive to align our conscious thoughts and ideas with the material world. The more accurately we can reflect reality in our consciousness, the more effectively and efficiently our practical activities can become. For example, through learning more about the mechanical, material, and physical processes which take place inside and of an automobile engine, and the more we can improve engines to make them more efficient and effective from practical applications. Lenin explains that consciousness develops from, quote, emotional consciousness to rational consciousness. Thought about a subject begins at the base level of consciousness that is rooted in emotional and sense-orientated conscious activity via vivid visualization, which then leads to rational abstract reflection. By vivid visualization, Lenin is referring to the active real-time experience of seeing and hearing, smelling, and otherwise sensing things and phenomena in the world. When the person experiences something through practical activity, the first conscious activity will tend to occur at the emotional and sensory level. In other words, the conscious activities which occur simultaneously along with practical activities. Only after this initial period of emotional consciousness will one be able to reflect on the experience on the more rational and abstract level. For example, if a zoologist in the field sees a species of bird they've never encountered before, the first conscious activity will be at the sensory emotional level. They will observe the shape, colorization, and motion of the bird. They may feel excitement, happiness, and other emotions. This is emotional conscious activity. This emotional conscious activity will then develop into rational conscious activity, as a zoologist may begin to consider things more abstractly, attempting to interpret and understand these experiences through reasons and rational reflection, asking such questions as, where does this bird nest? What does it feed on? Is this a new discovery? And so on. Such abstractions are not the endpoint of cognitive cycle, because consciousness must then continue to develop through practice. It is through practice that perceptions test and proves its own correctness, so that it can then continue to repeat the cycle. This is also the general rule of human perception and objective reality. Thus, there is a dialectical relationship between emotional consciousness, linked to practical activity, and rational consciousness, linked to purely conscious activity. This dialectical relationship is a cycle in which one engages in practical activities, which leads to emotional consciousness, which leads to rational consciousness, which then leads back to practical activity to test the correctness of the conclusions of rational conscious activity. We call this cycle the development of consciousness and cognitive processes. And I have a picture for everybody. Practical activities, emotional consciousness. Then here, rational consciousness, computing what you see, right? And then back to practical activities. This is cognitive process cycle. The cognitive process is a continuous cycle which describes the dialectical development of consciousness and practical activity. The cognitive process is explained in more detail below. Oh wait, is that the? Let me make sure. I think it is. Hold on. Okay, hold on a second. Development from emotional consciousness to rational consciousness. Emotional consciousness is the lower stage of cognitive process. In this stage of cognitive development, human uses, through practical activity, uses our senses to reflect objective things and phenomena with all their perceived specific characteristics, the rich manifestations in human consciousness. During this period, consciousness only reflects the phenomenon, i.e., phenomenon as opposed to essence. See, essence, the external manifestation of the previous subject. At this stage, consciousness has not yet reflected the essence, the nature, and or the regulating principles of the subject. Therefore, this is the lowest stage of development of cognitive process. In this stage, consciousness is carried out through three basic phases: sensation, conception, and symbolization. Human sensation of another objective thing or phenomenon is the simplest, most primitive phase of emotional consciousness stage of the cognitive processes. But without it, there would not be any perception of objective things or phenomena. Every human sensation of objective things and phenomena contains objective content. See, even though it arises as subjective human consciousness reflection, sensation is a subjective imagining of an objective world. It is the basis from which the next phase of emotional consciousness, conception, is formed. Conception is the reality, complete reflection within human consciousness of objective things and phenomena. Conception is formed as the basis of linking and synthesizing sensational experiences in things and phenomena, i.e. sensation. Compared with sensation, conceptions is a higher, fuller, richer form of consciousness, but it is still a reflection of the outward manifestation of objects. Conception does not yet reflect the essence, nature, and regulating principles of the perceived subject. Symbolization. It is the representation of an objective thing or phenomenon that has been reflected by sensation. and conception. It is the most advanced, most complex phase of the stage of emotional consciousness. At the same time, it also serves as a transitional step between emotional consciousness and rational consciousness. The defining characteristics of symbolism is the ability to reproduce symbolic ideas of objective things and phenomena within human consciousness. Symbolization describes the act of recreating the outward appearances of material things and phenomenon within human consciousness, which is the first step of abstraction and thus the first step towards rational consciousness. Here is an example of 3 phases of emotional consciousness stage of cognitive process. Emotional consciousness stage of cognitive process. Here we go. So, you're thinking of a cake. Well, or you either it's saying you see a cake. You think of it, cake. So that is sensation, seeing. This is conception, the cake. What is it? Symbolization, cake. All right. Number 1, sensation. Jessica sensed a cake in the window of a bakery. She sees the frosting, the shape of a cake, and the decorations which adorn the cake. She smells the cake. During this phase, objective data about the cake is received into her consciousness, developing into an immediate and subjective sense perception of the cake. The beginning of this cognitive activity will be purely sensory in nature. She may have been thinking of other things as she walked by the bakery, but the sight and smell of the cake, upon registering in her mind, will lead to the beginning and new cognitive process cycle. Conception. Jessica begins to conceive of the cake in her mind. More fully, she will associate an immediate sense, experience, and see the smelling the cake with other experiences she had with cake, and a complete mental image and concept of the cake will form in her mind. Symbolization. The word cake may now form in her mind, and she may begin thinking of the cake more abstractly as food, as a temptation, and in other ways, this is the beginning of abstraction of Jessica's mind, which then will lead to rational conscious activity. Note that all of these phases of emotional consciousness activity may take place very quickly, perhaps in a fraction of a second. It may coincide with other conscious activity, i.e., Jessica may simultaneously be thinking of a meeting she running late to, and any number of other things. At this point, Jessica will transition to the rational consciousness stage of the cognitive process, which is explained in more details below. By the end of the emotional stage of the cognitive process, consciousness has not yet reflected the essence, the nature, regulating principle, etc., of the perceived subject. Therefore, at the emotional stage, consciousness is not yet able to properly interpret the reflective subject. This is to say, emotional conscious activity does not meet the cognitive requirements to serve practical activity, including the need to creatively transform the objective world. To meet these requirements, emotional consciousness must develop into rational consciousness. Rational consciousness is the higher stage of cognitive process. It includes the indirect abstract and generalized reflection of the essential properties of the characteristics of things and phenomena. This stage of consciousness performs and the most important function of comprehending and interpreting the essence of the perceived subject. Rational consciousness is implemented through 3 basic phases: definition, judgment, and reasoning. Definition is the first phase of rational consciousness. I hit my flash goal? Thank you. I'm going to look back before I go to definition. It's good to see you, Aziz. Definition is the first phase of rational consciousness. During this phase, the mind begins to interpret, organize, and process the basic properties of things and phenomena at a rational level into a conceptual whole. The formation of definitions is the result of the summarization and the synthesis of all the different characteristics and properties of the subject and how the subject fits into the organized structure of knowledge which exists in the mind. Definition is the basis for forming judgment in cognitive process. Judgment is the next phase of rational consciousness, which arises from the definition of the subject, the linking of concepts and properties together, which leads to affirmative and negative ideation of certain characteristics or attributes of perceived subjects. According to the level of development of consciousness, judgment may take one of three forms: unique judgment, general judgment, universal judgment. Judgment is the form of judgment that expresses the broadest conception of objective reality. Reasoning. Reasoning is the final phase of rational consciousness, formed on the basis of synthesizing judgments so as to extrapolate new knowledge about the perceived subject. Before reasoning can take place, judgment must be transformed into knowledge. A judgment can be transformed into knowledge through one of two logical mechanisms: deductive inference, which extrapolates the general from the specific; the inductive inference, which extrapolates the specific form from the general. Here is an example of three phases of rational conscious stage of cognitive process continue from our previous examples of emotional consciousness stage. Here we go, another picture. So, right here, definition, they're defining it as a cake. This cake looks delicious, that's the judgment. Reason, cake, health, cake, money, cake, time. This is rational consciousness stage to cognitive process. They're seeing if they have the money, the health, and the time. 1. Definition. Jessica conception of the cake will transition into the rational consciousness activity of definition. Jessica will begin to define the concept of the cake more wholly and concretely, summarizing the synthesizing of the features and characteristics of the cake into a cohesive mental reflection of the cake. The word cake may become more pronounced and defined by Jessica's consciousness, prompting her to think of the object which she defines as a cake more fully and rationally. Judgment. Jessica will begin to form basic judgments about the cake. That cake looks good. That cake smells good, and so on. Next, these judgments will begin to transform into knowledge through inductive and deductive inferences. An inductive inference might be, quote, I generally enjoy eating cake, therefore I might enjoy eating this cake. An example of deductive inferences might be, this cake looks very delicious, therefore there might be other delicious things in this bakery. Reasoning, number 3. Processes of inductive or deductive inferences will begin to transform Jessica's judgment into a form of knowledge. For instance, she may now process such knowledge as, this bakery has delicious looking cakes. This is a cake I would like to eat, and so on. With a newly acquired knowledge, Jessica can begin reasoning. That is to say, she can begin making rational conclusions and decisions. She might conclude, I will go into the bakery and buy that cake. Note that Yet this is not the end of the cognitive process, because the final phase of the reasoning stage of the cognitive process, reasoning, will lead directly into a new cycle of cognitive process. In this example, Jessica might engage in the practical activity to check her watch to see the time, which will begin a new cycle of cognitive process, beginning with the sensation phase of the emotional stage of a visual sense data of her watch, and carry through the final reasoning phase of the rational stage, and so on. It should It should also be noted that this is merely an abstraction of the cognitive process. In reality, the human mind is incredibly complex, capable of carrying out a variety of cognitive processes simultaneously. That's why they're only giving you an example. At any given moment, a person might be considering various different subjects, and each different subject may be at a different stage of cognitive process. This abstract model of cognitive process is presented to help us comprehend and the component functions of consciousness more easily in the wider context of dialectical materialist philosophy. Specifically, this model of the cognitive process is intended to help us understand how human consciousness leads to truth, and truth here refers to the alignment of human consciousness with the material world, so that our perception and understanding of the world is accurate and represents the actual reality. The relationships between emotional consciousness, rational consciousness, and reality. Emotional consciousness and rational consciousness are stages that make up the cognitive cycle. In reality, they are often intertwined within cognitive processes, but they have different functions. If emotional consciousness is associated with reality and with the impact of sense data received from observing the material world, and is the basis for cognitive reason, then rational consciousness, based on higher cognitive understanding and abstraction, allows us to understand the essence, nature, regulating principles, and development process of things and phenomena. Rational consciousness helps direct emotional consciousness to a more efficient and effective direction, and leads it to more profound and accurate emotional consciousness. In other words, consider a subject at the level of rational consciousness allows us to then view the same subject at an emotional conscious level with more depth and awareness. For example, the more time we spent rationally considering something like a bicycle, the more quickly and accurate we can examine a bicycle at the level of emotional consciousness. If someone is looking at a bike for the first time, they might be able to distinguish its component parts or functions. On the other hand, if someone has spent more time considering bicycles at the level of rational consciousness, they may be able to immediately and rapidly understand the process, a bicycle at the emotional conscious level, so that they can perceive and comprehend the different parts of the bicycle, as well as their functions immediately and at the emotional sensory level. However, if we stop at rational consciousness, we will only have knowledge about the subject we perceive, but we still won't really know if that knowledge is truly accurate or not. In order to be useful in practical activity, we must consciously determine whether knowledge is truth, i.e., whether knowledge accurately reflects reality. In order to determine the truth of knowledge, consciousness must necessarily return to reality. Consciousness must use reality as a criterion, a measurement of the authenticity of knowledge gained through purely cognitive process. In other words, all consciousness is ultimately derived from practical needs and must also return to serve practical activities. Here we go, another picture. It's just a simple picture. Mutual development, conscious activity, practical activity. They work hand in hand with each other. That's all they're saying. Dialectical relationships between consciousness and practical activity means that consciousness activities develop practical activities and vice versa in a conscious feedback loop. One fundamental principle of dialectical materialism is that the material determines the ideal, and the ideal impacts the material. The fact that material determines consciousness is reflected in the fact that material needs lead to the development of consciousness, and that conscious activity stems from material needs. The fact that the ideal impact the material is reflected in the fact that consciousness must always return to the service of practical activity as our consciousness develops. Along with knowledge, our ability to impact and transform the material world becomes more efficient and effective. We have another picture. The Nick Fuentes one is wild. All right, so here we go. Let's see here. Between then we imagine better things of doing things. Okay, hold on. Then practical experience tells us those ideas are valuable. There you go. Hold on, I'm going to read about it now. The dialectical relationship between consciousness and practical activity is what drives the development of humanity. We imagine better ways of doing things, then test those ideas against reality through practical activity. So yeah, he was imagining and now he's doing it. Got it. This dialectical relationship between consciousness and practical activity is thus cyclical. Consciousness activity arises from practical activity and returns to practical activity in an endless process of developing both conscious ability as well as practical ability. Therefore, it can be seen that the general cyclical nature of the process of movement and development of consciousness development from practice to consciousness, from consciousness to practice, from practical activity to the continued process of cognitive development, and so on. This process is repeated continuously without end. The development level of consciousness and practice in the next cycle are often higher than in the previous cycle, and the cognitive process gradually develops more and more accurately. Occurrence? Hold on. I'm going to look up this word. It's a simple word, but for some reason it's giving me brain. It's accuracy. Sorry, everybody. Accuracy, as well as a fuller and deeper knowledge about objective reality. The universal law of consciousness is also a concrete and vivid manifestation of the universal laws of materialist dialectics, including the law of negation and the law of transformation between quantity and quality, and the unity of law of unity and contradiction between opposites. The process of cognitive motion and development governed by these general laws is the process of human progress towards absolute truth. The universal law of consciousness is governed by the three universal laws of materialist dialectics. The law of negation dictates that the new will arise from the old, but will carry forward characteristics from the old. This is reflected in the universal law of consciousness, in that conscious activity arises from practical activity. This conscious activity then develops into improving practical activity, and so on, in a never-ending cycle of development. Throughout this development process, characteristics of previous cycles and cognitive and practical activity are carried forward and transferred to a new cycle of cognitive and practical activities. The law of transformation between quantity and quality recognizes that quantity develop into changes in quality, and vice versa. This is reflected in the universal law of consciousness and development of both conscious and practical activities. Conscious development also develops from quantitative changes to quality changes, and vice versa. For example, one person accumulates a certain quantity of knowledge, and the quality of their knowledge will change. For example, one person has learned the function of every component part of a car engine. They will have a quality shift in their understanding of car engines. They will now have competency of the functions of the engine as a whole. This is also true of practical activities. A quantity of practical experiences will lead to a quality shifts in practical abilities. For example, once a person has practiced riding a bicycle enough that they can reliably ride the bicycle without falling, we would say that the person knows how to ride a bicycle, which presents a qualitative shift from the state of learning how to ride a bicycle. The law of unity and contradictions between opposite states that all things, phenomena and idea, are defined by internal and external contradictions. This is reflected in the universal law of consciousness by the fact that practical needs serve as the basis of conscious activity, and that cognitive processes serve in essence to negate contradictions between consciousness and material reality through practical experience. In other words, the cognitive process is defined by a near-ending process of contradictions between the material and the ideal, as human beings seek to negate contradictions between our conscious understanding of the world and our practical experience in searching of truth, the accurate alignment of consciousness with the material world. B. Truth and the relationship between truth and reality. Definition of truth. Did I Nick Fuentes? All cognitive processes lead to the creation of knowledge, which is what we call human understanding of objective reality. But not only knowledge has content consistent with objective reality, because consciousness exists as a subjective reflection of objective reality in the human mind. The collective cognitive practice of all of humanity throughout history has, as well as the cognitive practice of each individual human being, has demonstrated that the knowledge which people have gained and are gaining is now always consistent with the objective reality. On the contrary, there are many cases of misalignments between consciousness and reality, and even complete contradictions between human thought and objective reality. Within the theoretical scope of Marxism-Leninism, the concept of truth is used to refer to knowledge which is aligned with objective reality. This alignment is tested and proven through practice. In this sense, the concept of truth is not identical to the concept of knowledge, nor with the concept of hypothesis. According to Lenin, the coincidence of thought with the object is a process. Thought equal man must not imagine truth in the form of dead repose, in the form of a bare picture, image, pale métis, without impulse, without motion. Here, Lenin is dispelling Hegel's conception of absolute truth, which is not to be confused with Lenin's concept of absolute truth as objective truth, which aligns consciousness with the objective reality. For Hegel, quote, absolute truth, end quote, was the idea that there will eventually be some endpoint to the process of rational consciousness, at which we will finally arrive to some final stage of knowledge and consciousness. This rational endpoint of consciousness is at which the dialectic ends and all contradictions are negated, as Hegel's absolute truth. Lenin also pushing back against the metaphysical concepts that all truths exist as stagnant categories of information which do not change. Instead, Lenin points out that seeking truth, i.e., aligning consciousness with the material reality, is a never-ending process in particular because reality is constantly developing and changing. Thus, the alignment of consciousness with reality, the pursuit of truth, is a living and dynamic process which will never end, since the development of reality will never end. The properties of truth. All truths are objective, relative, absolute, and concrete. The objectivity of truth is the dependence of its content from the subjective will of human beings. The content of knowledge must be aligned with objective reality, not vice versa. This means that the content of accurate knowledge is not to produce of pure subjective reasoning. Truth is not an arbitrary human contract, nor is truth inherent in consciousness. On the contrary, truth belongs to the objective world and is determined by the objective world. The affirmation of the objectivity of truth is one of fundamental points that distinguishes the concept of absolute truth, dialectical materialism, from objective existence of the physical world, and deny the possibility that humans are able to perceive the world. The dialectical materialist conception of objective truth stands in contrast to idealism, which states that conscious reasoning alone leads to truth, and that subjective ideal determines material reality. This objectivity of truth also refutes skepticism, which states that truth is essentially undiscoverable because human consciousness is ultimately unreliable and incapable of accurately reflecting material reality. Distinction must also be drawn between the concepts of absolute truth as it is understood in dialectical materialism philosophy and a conception of absolute truth in Hegel's idealist dialectics. Dialectical materialism defines absolute truth as objective truth. That is to say, a complete alignment between objective reality and human consciousness is compared to relative truth, which is a partial alignment between consciousness and objective reality. Hegel, on the other hand, views absolute truth as a final point in which human consciousness will have achieved absolute, complete, and final understanding of our universe, with the ideal serving as the first basis and primary mechanism from bringing absolute truth to fruition. Truth is not only objective, but also absolute and relative. Absolute truth refers to truth which reflects a full and complete alignment of consciousness and reality. Theoretically, we can reach absolute truth. This is because in the objective world, there exists no thing nor phenomenon which human beings are completely incapable of accurately perceiving. The possibility of acquiring absolute truth in the process of development and consciousness understanding is theoretically limitless. However, in reality, our conscious ability to reflect reality is limited by specific material conditions in each generation of humanity, of practical lamentations, and by the spatial and temporal conditions of reflecting subjects. Therefore, truth is also relative. Dialectical materialist philosophy recognizes that it must be theoretically possible to know everything there is to know about a given subject, since we are theoretically capable of accurately perceiving, sensing, and measuring all data which pertains to a subject. However, dialectical materialism also recognizes the practical limitations of human beings, as Engels writes in Anti-Düring. If mankind ever reached the stage at which it should work only with eternal truths, with results of thought which possess sovereign validity and an unconditional claim to truth, it would then have reached the point where the infinity of the intellectual world, both in its actuality and in its potentiality, had been exhausted, and thus the famous miracle of the counted uncountable would have been performed. But there are any truths which are so securely based that any doubt of them seems to us to be tantamount to ridiculousness. That twice two makes four, and that three angles of a triangle are equal to two right angles. That Paris is in France. That a man who gets no food dies of hunger, and so forth. Are there then nevertheless eternal truths, final and ultimate truths? Certainly there are. We can divide the whole realm of knowledge in the traditional way into three great departments. First includes all sciences that deal with inanimate nature and are, to a greater or lesser degree, susceptible of mathematical treatment. Mathematics, astronomy, mechanics, physics, chemistry. If it gives anyone any pleasure to use mighty words for very simple things, it can be asserted that certain results obtained by these sciences are eternal truths, final and ultimate truths, for which reasons these sciences are known as the exact sciences. But very far from all their results have this validity. With the introductions of variable magnitudes and the extension of their variability to their infinitely small and infinitely large mathematics, usually too strictly ethical, fell from grace. It ate of the tree of knowledge, which opened up to it a career of most colossal achievements, but at the same time a path of error. The virgin state of absolute validity and irrefutable proof of everything mathematical has gone forever. The realm of controversy was inaugurated, and we have reached a point where most people differentiate and integrate, not because they understand what they are doing, but from pure faith, because up to now it has always come out right. Things are even worse with astronomy and mechanics, and in physics and in chemistry. We are swamped with hypotheses as if attacked by swarms of bees, and it must of necessity be so. In physics, we are dealing with the motions of molecules. In chemistry, with the formation of molecules out of atoms. And if the interference of light waves is not a myth, we have absolutely no prospect of ever seeing these interesting objects with our own eyes. As time goes on, finally, the ultimate truths become remarkably rare in this field. Relative truth is truth, which has developed alignment with reality without yet having reached complete alignment between human knowledge and the reality which it reflects. It puts it another way. Relative truth represents knowledge which incompletely reflects material subjects without complete accuracy. In relative truth, there is only partial alignment in some but not all aspects between consciousness and the material world. All right. False consciousness is consciousness which is incorrect and misaligned from reality. Discovering the roots out false consciousness is one of the primary concerns of dialectical materialism, as false consciousness can be a serious impediment to human progress. The term false consciousness was first used by Friedrich Engels in the personal letter to Franz Mehring in 1893, a decade after the death of Karl Marx. And in this letter, Engels uses the term interchangeably with the word ideology to describe conscious thought process which do not align with reality. Here's what Engels says. Ideology is a process accomplished by the so-called thinker, consciously indeed, but with a false consciousness. The real motive impelling him remain unknown to him. Otherwise, it would not be an ideological process at all. Hence, he imagines false are apparent motives. Because it is a process of thought, he derives both its form and its content from pure thought, neither his own or that of his predecessors. He works with mere thought material which he accepts without examination as the product of thought. He does not investigate further for a more remote process independent of thought. Indeed, its origin seems obvious to him, because as all action is produced through the medium of thought, it also appears to him to be ultimately based upon thought. The ideologists who deal with history. History is here simply meant to comprise all the spheres, political, judicial, philosophical, theoretical, belonging to society and not only to nature. The ideologist has formed itself independently out of thought of previous generations and has gone through an independent series of development in the brains of these successive generations. True, eternal facts belong to its own or other spheres may have exercised a co-determining influence on those development, but the tactic presuppositions is that these facts themselves are also only the fruits of a process of thought, and so we still remain within the realm of pure thought, which has successfully digested the hardest facts. Although the term false consciousness is not found in the writings until after Marx's death, the concept underlining the term false consciousness is found often in the works of Marx and Engels. For instance, in The Holy Family, Marx and Engels explains how communist, class-conscious workers have been able to break free of false consciousness of capitalist society. They, the communist workers, are most painfully aware of the difference between being and thinking, between consciousness and life. They know that property, capital, money, wage labor, and the like are no ideal figments of the brain, but very practical, very objective products of their self-estrangement. This allusion to, quote, the difference between being and thinking recurs again and again in the works of Marx and Engels. Lenin also discussed the concept of false consciousness extensively and argued that dialectical materialism was the key to negating the false consciousness of the working class, writing in What the Friend of the People Are. Here's Lenin. It never has been the case, nor is it so now, that the members of society conceive the sum total of social relations unconsciously. Hold on. Let me read it again. It never has been the case, nor is it so now, that the members of society conceive the sum total of social relations in which they have lived as something definite, integral, pervaded by some principles. On the contrary, the mass of the people adapt themselves to these relations unconsciously and have so little conception of them as specific historical social relations that, for instance, an explanation of the exchange relation under which people have lived for centuries was found only in very recent times. Materialism removed this contradiction by carrying the analysis deeper to the origins of man's social ideas themselves, and its conclusion that the course of the ideas depend on the course of things in which the only one compatible with scientific psychology. Further, And from yet another aspect, this hypothesis was the first to evaluate sociology to the level of a science. Note that this convention of using the word ideology to mean false consciousness what has been common, and Marx and Engels both use the word ideology more often in its more usual sense of a system of ideas, but it is still occasionally encountered in socialist literature, as Joseph McCartney explains in Marx Myths and Legends. Sorry. Boop, boop, beep. Yep. Marx never called ideologies false consciousness. Indeed, he never called anything false consciousness, a phrase that does not occur in his works. The noun is almost always accompanied by the epithet, such as German, Republican, political, or Hegelian, or by a qualifying phrase, as in the ideology of the bourgeoisie or the ideology of the political economist. More typical is in any case as a objectival usage in which such varied items as forms, expression, phrases, conception, deception, and distortion are said to have an ideological character. Even more distinctive as is the frequency, amounting to approximately half of all references in the relevant range of invocations of the ideologists, the creators and purveyors of the ideological forms. Relative truth and absolute truth do not exist separately, but have identical unity with each other. On the one hand, absolute truth is the sum of all relative truth. On the other hand, all relative truth are always elements of absolute truth. Lenin wrote that absolute truth results from the sum total of relative truths in the course of their development. Relative truth represents relative faithful reflections of an object existing independently of man. These reflections become more and more faithful. Every scientific truth, notwithstanding its relative nature, contains an element of absolute truth. Correct realization of the dialectical relationship between relative and absolute truth plays a very important role in criticizing the overcoming extremism of false consciousness and the perception of and inaction. If we exaggerate the absoluteness of the truth of knowledge which we possess, or downplay its relativity, we will fall into false consciousness of metaphysics, dogmatism, and conservatism, and stagnation. Intentional and unintentional exaggeration of absoluteness of truth, i.e. considered our knowledge to be more complete and or aligned with the reality that in actually is led to incorrect viewpoints and mindsets, including metaphysics, is a philosophical system which seeks truth from a systematic categorization of knowledge. This is a flawed method of seeking knowledge because it considers truth to be essentially static and unchanged, and upholds the erroneous notion that truth can be systematically broken down into discrete, isolated categories. In addition to being fundamentally correct about the nature of truth and knowledge, it leads to the incorrect presumption that such static categorization of knowledge can lead to truth at all. Metaphysics fails to see truth and consciousness as a process, and instead sees truth as a static assembly of categorized facts and data. Dogmatism occurs when one only accounts for commonalities and considers theory itself as the sole basis of truth. Dogmatism inherently... Hold on, I got a picture. Yeah, I did it right first time. Dogmatism occurs when one only accounts for commonalities and considers theory itself as the sole basis of truth. Dogmatism inherently overstates the absoluteness of knowledge, as dogmatic positions uphold certain theoretical principles as complete viable, and completely developed. This explicitly denies the continuously developing process and advancing knowledge and consciousness. Conservatism includes any position that seeks to prevent change or to undo change to return to an early state of development. Such positions deny the continuous development of consciousness, knowledge, and practice, and incorrectly asserts incorrect positions or mistakes relative truth for absolute truth. Stagnation. Yeah, I can tell. Stagnation is the inability or unwillingness to change and adapt consciousness and practice in accordance with developing material conditions. Stagnation can stem from or cause overstatement of absolute truth in theory and forestall necessary development in both consciousness and practical ability. On the contrary, if we exaggerate the relativity of the truth of knowledge which we possess, or downplay its absoluteness, we will fall into relativism, thereby leading to subjectivism, revisionism, sophistry, and skepticism. Oh my gosh. Relativism is a belief that human consciousness can only achieve relative understanding of the world, and that truth can therefore never be objectively discovered. Relativism is thus the overstatement of the relative nature of truth and the denial of the existence of absolute truth. Relative leads to such incorrect viewpoints and mindsets as subjectivism, which occurs when one centers one's own self in one's own conscious activities and the perspective of worldviews, failing to test their own perceptions against material and social reality. This position denies that truth can be discovered in the external material world, falsely believing that absolute truth stems only from conscious activity. Revisionism, a failure to recognize and accept commonalities in conscious activity, focusing only on the private. Revisionism leads to constant and unnecessary reassignment and reevaluation of both knowledge and practice. Revisionism thus is a position which overstates the relativity of truth and ignores truths which are more fully developed towards absoluteness. Sophistry, the use of falsehood and fallacious arguments to deceive. Sophistry is, thus, the intentional denial of truth and the intentional mischaracterization of truth as either overtly relative or as not truth at all. Skepticism, the belief that truth is essentially undiscoverable because human consciousness is ultimately unreliable and incapable of accurately reflecting material reality. By denying that truth is discoverable at all, skepticism implicitly rejects absolute truth and declares that all truth is relative and unreliable. In addition to objectivity, absoluteness, and relativity, truth also is concreteness. The concreteness of truth refers to the degree to which a truth is accepted to specific objects in specific conditions at a specific point in time. This means that all accurate knowledge always refers to a specific situation which involves specific subjects which exist in a specific place and time. The content of truth cannot be pure abstraction, disconnected from reality, but it is always associated with certain specific objects and phenomena which exist in the specific space, time, and arrangement, with specific internal and external relationships. Therefore, truth is associated with specific historical conditions. This specificity to time, place, relation, etc., is what we call concreteness. Knowledge, if detached from specific historical conditions, will fall into pure abstraction. Therefore, it will not be accurate. It will not align with reality, and such knowledge cannot be considered truth. When emphasizing this property, Lenin wrote, quote, "Truth is always concrete, never abstract. Mastering the principles of concreteness of truth has an important methodological significance in cognitive and practical activities. It is required that considerations and evaluations of all things phenomena must be based on historical viewpoint. In developing and applying theory, we must be conscious of specific historical conditions. According to Lenin, Marxism, nature its essence lies in the concrete analysis of specific situations. Marx's method is, above all, to consider the objective content of the historical processes in specific time. In other words, Marxism is rooted in seeking truth by examining reality from historical and comprehensive viewpoints. Roles of truth in reality. The role of truth in reality. We're doing all right. God bless you, kid. I'm probably older than you. Oh my gosh. In order to survive and develop, humans must conduct practical activities. These activities involve transforming the environment, nature, and human society. At the same time, through these activities, humans perform, knowingly and unknowingly, the process of perfecting and developing our conscious and practical abilities. It is this process that helps human cognitive activities develop. Practical activities can only be successful and effective once humans apply accurate knowledge of objective reality to our practical activities. Therefore, truth is one of the prerequisites that ensures success and efficiency in practical activities. The relationship between truth and practical activities is a dialectical relationship, which serves as a basis for the movement and development of both truth and practical activities. Truth develops through practice, and practice develops through the correct application of truth which people have gained through practical activities. Oh my God, they came back. So, truth, practical activities, right there. Mutual development. Truth and practical activities have a dialectical relationship in which truth through practice, and practice develops through the correct application of truth. Practice only develops when truth about the universe is consciously applied to practical activities. For example, farm output increases as we learn more truth about way crops grow and how land can properly manage. Simultaneously, truth can only be developed through practical activity, as all ideas and knowledge must be tested through methodological observation, experimentations, and other forms of practical activity. A theory is an idea or system of ideas intended to explain an aspect, characteristics, or tendencies of objective reality. Theories are not inherently truthful. Holding incorrect theories constitute false consciousness, practice, or praxis, and purposeful conscious activities which improves our understanding of the world. Theory and practice have a dialectical relationship with one another, which, if understood, helps us to discover truth. Another picture. This is the relationship. There you go. And I'll probably read about it. Truth and practical activities mutually develop one another over time. This dialectical relationship between theory and practical activity means that we must never favor theory over practice, nor practice over theory, but we must rather balance development of theoretical understanding as we engage in practical activities to test our knowledge against reality and to develop our practice with ever advancing understanding of the world. as practice and theory developed one another, our understanding of objective reality comes closer and closer to truth. In the thesis of Feuerbach, Marx summarizes the relationship between theory and practice, writing, "The problem of the external world is here put as a problem of its transformation, the problem of the cognition of the external world as an integral part of the problem in transformation, the problem of theory as the problem of theory as a practical problem. Here, Marx explains that theory is concerned with solving the problem and of transforming the external world through practice, and that cognition and of the internal world is required to solve the problem of transformation. In other words, we must improve our theory in order to improve our practical ability to transform our world, and we learn about the world, thus improving our theory through those practical activities." Marx also wrote in Thesis on Feuerbach that the question whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but it is a practical question. In practice, man must prove the truth, that is, the reality and power of his thinking. This point is key for understanding the dialectical relationship between practice and theory. In order to be useful, theory must be proven through practice. Thus, we must seek to develop our practice through theory and our theory through practice. Engels summarized these ideas as a bit more colorful in socialism, utopian and scientific. Before there was an agreement, there was action. In the beginning was the deed, and human action had solved a difficulty long before human ingenuity invented it. The proof of the pudding is in eating. Engels wrote in Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy of the uselessness of what might be called pure theory, divorced from practice, and the sort of radical skepticism which refutes that any practical knowledge can never really be obtained by human beings. There is yet a set of different philosophers, those who question the possibility of any cognition, or at least of the exhaustive cognition of the world. The most telling refutation of this skepticism and antagonism as I gotta look up the word, everybody. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Let me make sure. Agnosticism. Skepticism and agnosticism, as of all other philosophical crotchets, is praxis, namely experiment and industry. It is practice, according to Engels, which proves the merit and utility of theory through experiment and industry, through practical activities in the material world. We can test our ideas and dialectically develop both theory and practice. Lenin built upon these ideas in his own work, writing in Materialism and Imperialist Criticism. The materialist theory, the theory of the reflection of objects by our mind, is here presented with absolute clarity. Things exist outside of us. Our perception and ideas are their images. Verification of these images, differentiation between true and false image, is given by practice. Here, Lenin explains how only a proper understanding and application of the dialectical relationship between theory and practice can lead to the negation of false consciousness and the dialectical development of both practice and theory. Simply argue and debating about ideas without relating them directly to practice will never lead to truth nor will such pure theory argumentations develop theory or practice in any meaningful way. That brings to mind another line from Marx, Thesis and Feuerbach. The dispute over the reality or non-reality of thinking that is isolated from practice is purely a scholastic question. The philosophy of dialectical materialism and the system of materialist dialectics are designed specifically to produce action and to avoid such scholastic questions and pure theory argumentation. Ho Chi Minh summarizes these ideas perhaps most clearly and precisely of all in a very little of his article, Practice Generates Knowledge, Understanding Advances Theory, Theory Leads to Practice. Knowledge comes from practice, and through practice, knowledge becomes theory. That theory again, as to be put into practice, knowledge advances not just from thought to theory, but above all, from playing the theory to revolutionary practice. Once the world's laws is fully grasped as theory, it is critical to put the theory into practice by changing the world, by increasing production, and by practicing class struggle and struggle for national self-determination. This is the continuous process of obtaining knowledge. And that is the end. That is the end. So we're going to read part 2, Historical Materialism. This section covers the definitions and basic principles of historical materialism, which is the field of work dedicated to applying dialectical materialism and materialist dialectics to human history and human society. The West historical materialism and dialectical materialism are often conflated, but this is an error. Historical materialism is an applied field of dialectical materialist philosophy and materialist dialectic methodology, which is used in pursuit of understanding and interpreting human history. That is part 2, and that's what we're going to read next. And then we're going to be waiting on political economy is part 3, but that's going to be long way. And it says this section coincides with 3 cardinal volumes of Capital from Karl Marx and covers 3 primary doctrines: the doctrine of value, the doctrine of surplus value, the doctrine of monopolist capitalism and state monopoly capitalism. Political economy in this course can be considered an application of dialectical materialism and materialist dialectics to the analysis of understanding of capitalist mode of production from the perspective of socialist revolutionary movement. And then part 4, this is later, scientific socialism. This section relies on the established understanding of dialectical materialism, historical materialism, and political economy as the foundation for developing socialist revolution. The 3 chapters in this section of scientific socialism are historical missions of the working class of the socialist revolution, the primary social political issues of the process of building socialist revolution, the realistic socialism and potential socialism, and that will be the last. So yeah, that's it. That is it. Okay, does anybody have any questions in the comments or anything? I can't have anybody up, so that sucks. I'm sorry that I can't have people up. I'm gonna go look for the next one real quick and download it right now. This book rocked. Okay, cool, thank you. All right, where's it at? There it is. No, that's number 1. Okay, I have to go back down. There it is. Found it. Part 2. See if I can get it to go. I think it's just this one, right? let's find out if I got it in here. Did it show up? I hope it did. How many pages is it? This one's pretty short. This one's short. Well, it's a little longer. Actually, it's a little longer. Let me see if I got it in here now. Yay! All right. Do I have it down here somewhere? Hold on a second. Hold on a second, everybody. Oh, no, that's my screen. Okay. Okay, no. All right, cool. Let's do something here real quick. I want to look at something. Let's check out the. I'm gonna check out the table of contents real quick. Where's the table of contents? Dedication, preface. Got some Ho Chi Minh stuff up here. Looking for the table of contents. Where are you? You know what? Does it have it here? No, they don't. Oh my god. Oh yeah, I can't add a bookmark. Okay. Where are you? Table of contents? Any minute now. Still looking, everybody. Sorry. Editor notes. Contributor notes. Blah, blah, blah. More notes. Original one. Original one. Table of contents. Finally found it. Introduction. The role of material production. Material production and its roles. Material production and the mode of production. The role of material production and the role of the mode of production in the original development of human society. The law of stability between the relations of production and the development of productive forces. Definitions of productive forces and dialectical relations between productive forces and the relations of production. Dialectics and the base and superstructure. Ooh. Definition of the base and the superstructure. Definition of base, definition of superstructure. Number 2, dialectical relations between the base and the superstructure. The base determines the superstructure. The superstructure impacts the base. Chapter 3, social being determines social consciousness and relative independence of social consciousness. Social being determines social consciousness. Definition of social being and social consciousness. The decisive role of social being and social consciousness. The relative independence of social consciousness. Chapter 4, social economic formation theory. Categories of social economic formation. The natural historical process of development of social economic foundation. Scientific value and the theory of social economic foundation. Chapter 5, the role of class struggle and class revolution. Going to be interesting. Definition of class, the original class, the role of class struggle in motion and development of society, social revolution and their roles of developing class society, definition of social revolution and its cause, the role of social revolution in development of class society. Chapter 6, historical materialist viewpoint about humans and the history creating roles of the masses. And that's humans and human nature. Definition of human nature. I might disagree with that part. Definition of the masses and the history created and roles of the masses. Definition of masses, the history creating roles of the masses of individuals. That's gonna be fun. Okay. All right. Got it ready to go for tomorrow. Get rid of this. All right, since no one has any questions, I'm trying to get rid of something here real quick. Okay, so no one has any questions, I am gonna go ahead and close it out. All right, tomorrow will be historical materialism in the second part. All right, everybody. I wish you all well. Have a good one.